Good evening. My name is Linda Flowers. I'm the president of the Carbondale Branch NAACP. It is my pleasure to extend a warm welcome on behalf of the Carbondale Branch. This is the first in a series of monthly community conversations to be held the third Tuesday of each month around election and voting issues. The March conversation topic is the voting rights legislation yet to be passed by the United States Congress. Tonight, we have Dr. John Jackson of the SIU Paul Simon Public Policy Institute presenting on the topic of the 2020 election results, examining who voted, where, when, and how, as well as how the results of the 2020 census may impact upcoming elections. If you have questions this evening, please write them in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen. We have Carbondale NAACP branch member Robin Johnson, who will be facilitating the Q&A for us this evening. With that said, I present to some of you and introduce to others Dr. John Jackson.
Thank you. Let me start by saying I appreciate very much the opportunity to join you this evening in what I think is a great example of community and library cooperation and the facilitation of this community conversation. I understand it's the first in a series that you plan to have, and in my estimation, we need way more civic education. We need way more community conversations like this, and I thank both organizations for taking the initiative on this. Dr. Flowers got in touch with me and asked me to talk about two different but interrelated kind of topics. She mentioned them briefly. I would say I'm going to talk first about recap the election results from 2020, especially from the standpoint of demographic analysis. Some people now call this sort of identity group analysis, the group-based turnout, voting patterns, and so forth. It's the standard stuff you see in newspapers and hear on television all the time. And then secondly, the census data and all of that stuff that we now have gotten, the 2020 census, of course, which we all know now about. This will be the first election held under those new census data results. And of course, it's going to have a 10-year-long impact on our politics and on our finances. So it's a terribly important topic. So let me start with the group-based or demographic analysis. This is a long tradition in the discipline of political science. I taught parties and public opinion and stuff like that for years. This goes back 50, 75 years of research in my discipline. Political scientists know a lot about why people turn out and why people vote as they do after they get to the polls. So these are two quite different but interrelated concepts. Number one, turnout. You got to get registered. You got to get people to get registered to be able to go vote. And then there is the direction. When you get there, you got to pull the lever, or you got to color in the coloring thing on the currently on our those displays that we have that we're voting on now. And so I'm going to put up on this slide, and I thank Jennifer for doing the slides for me this evening. This that we have first here is turnout overall. And you can see, of course, turnout was 66.8. For context, that is very high compared to other elections. It's the highest turnout level since George Bush and Bill Clinton went at it in 1992. And that one was only slightly higher than this one. It's up 5 points from 2016, when turnout was only 61.4 eligible votes of the eligible voters, and that one was down actually from 2012. So turnout's up. Take home from that. Turnout among white voters was 71%. It was 65% in 2016. So white is up by +6, as you can see. Turnout among Black voters was 62%. For comparison, it was 60% in 2016, so it was up by +3. But take note of when President Obama ran, it was 61% in 2008, but it was 67% in 2012. And that 67% was the highest of the turnout mark so far for Black voters. Turnout notably was also up for Asian American voters, for Latino or Hispanic voters, and importantly, for non-college educated white voters. For non-college educated white voters, turnout was 64%, and that's the highest it had been since 2000. College educated white voters was 82%. That was up by 3 from the 79% that we achieved in 2016. Now, among young voters, the 18 to 24 category is always the lowest. It was the lowest again this year, but it is above 50% for the first time ever. So young voters got involved. They have fairly pitiful turnout rates when 50% or slightly above is the high water mark, but nevertheless, it was the best it's been. Rural, suburban, urban voters, they are all up, as I've got summarized there at the bottom of the page. Now, if we could go to slide 2. All right, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly and just hit the highlights. If you've got an idea that you want to share, or if you've got a question, just make a note of it, and I'll be glad to come back to it because I'm going to save some time, and we're going to do that at the end. Age again first, and we're going to look at which direction they voted, which of course is the second stage of that analysis. Get you there, then for whom did you vote? 18 to 29, and those percentages under those age categories is what percent of the total electorate that they constituted in that. In other words, 17% of the total voters came from the 18 to 29 category. So that was a good group. In fact, the best group for Joe Biden. He got 60% of those. He got 52% of those who are still young, but in the 30 to 45. And then it flipped over just by a tad in middle age group, as you can see there. Trump got 50%, Biden got 49% of that group. And then us old folks in the Social Security generation were 22% of the total. That was a better group for Donald Trump than it was for Joe Biden, 52 to 47. Now, the next one, there's no more powerful explanatory variable than this one. You don't know anything else about how you're analyzing a person or a group, find out what their party ID is, because you can see Joe Biden got 94% of the Democrats. On the other hand, Donald Trump got 94% of the Republicans. So the next one's really the most important of all, and that is Biden got 54% of the independents and Trump only got 41. Actually, Donald Trump won the independents in 2016. So that was a major shift in the direction of Joe Biden. Ideologies, probably the second most important of anything that you'd want to know about them. Again, not surprising, that's all common sense, but you had to document even common sense. Liberals, who constituted 24%, 89% of them voted for Joe Biden. 10% of them voted for Donald Trump. On the other end, conservatives, 85% voted for Trump, 14% for Biden. Not terribly surprising. But again, the most important category here is the moderates. 64% voted for Biden and only 34% voted for Trump. Now, this is by far the most important of these, and this is the one that changed considerably in the 4 years since the last election. All right, so I pulled it all together there below in that next one, I believe, and that is, yes, you have that at the bottom of your page. Let me again just highlight Biden got 41% of white voters, Trump got 58%. Among Black voters, 87% went to Biden, Trump got 12%. That's actually a little bit low for Black voters compared certainly to, not surprisingly, both of the Obama elections, but even by Hillary Clinton, it's about the same in her case. Latino, 65% went to Biden, Trump got 32, Asian Americans 61% to 34, and the category of others, 55% went to Joe Biden. You probably sort of know all of this stuff, but again, I think it helps to be able to demonstrate it. And something like, for example, region, you may not have these figures sort of at the tip of your tongue, but again, highlighting the important ones. The East was the best area for Joe Biden. He got 58% to Trump's 41. We in the Midwest went for Trump, 51-47. Not surprising, the South went for Trump, 53-46, but that is actually lower for the South than they've been going against Democratic candidates now for a number of years. So Biden actually did a little better in the South than Democrats usually do. And then finally, the West was almost as good for Joe Biden as the East, 57% for Biden, 41% for Trump. As you can see, under religion, Protestants a big and amorphous category, as we all know, but Protestant went 60% for Trump, 39% for Biden. I'll go back and disaggregate that in just a minute and get it a little bit more refined, but this is a critical group for Donald Trump. 60% of Protestants voted for Donald Trump. On the other hand, Catholics slightly exceeded what Catholics usually do, maybe because Joe Biden has been a good Catholic and highly identified as a good Catholic for all of his life. Used to be that Catholics voted much more heavily for the Democrats, but they've actually been voting about even or even for the Republicans slightly in earlier elections. So it was a bit of a help that Catholics went 52% for their co-religionists. Others and no religion identification at all, 69% and 65% for Joe Biden. That too is an important and growing group if you'd like to come back to that again. Okay, gender. You all know we've had a gender gap for a long time. We've still got a gender gap. It's maybe not quite as big this time, but male voters went 53-45 for Trump over Biden. Women voters went 52-42 for 10% difference. That, in fact, was a big help, obviously, for Joe Biden. And by the way, there are more women voters than men voters, which is what is indicated at the top of the column there. And that's been true and about there for the last 4 or 5 censuses, for example. Area type, urban voters, you all know Biden did extremely well, 60% in urban voters. Rural voters, you probably know this, overwhelmingly 57% for Donald Trump. But again, in the middle sort of there, the most important story there is 50% for Biden, 48% for Trump. That's very good in the suburbs for a Democratic candidate. Joe Biden partially won the election right there in the suburbs, certainly won the election in Illinois in the suburbs as well as in Chicago and Cook County. All right, let's go to income next. I believe you've got that. And income on slide 4, those who make less than 50,000, Joe Biden got those folks, 55-44. Now, 50K and up, he also got those, but by a narrow margin of 51-47. But breaking income out differently, if they are less than 100,000, a year, Biden got 56, but if they're above 100,000 a year, Trump got 54. So that big difference in that swing there is between 50,000 and 100,000. Okay, the next, excuse me, let me chase this frog. Now, the breakout on white born-again evangelical Christians, you've probably read about this. It was very, very strong group for Donald Trump in 2016. It was an equally strong group for Donald Trump 4 years later. He got 76%. That is the biggest single group that of all of the ones you can identify, probably the most important part of the Trump coalition. Not identifying as born-again evangelical Christian, 62% of them went to Joe Biden. So in summary, it's easy, I think, to see the overall patterns of group and identity voting in the 2020 election. It's been that same pattern building certainly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as we've become more and more polarized, and polarization really just took off and became heavily endemic to American politics from the turn of the century on. If anything, it's been growing, and we are deeply divided by race, by religion, by region, by age, partisanship, ideology, education, place of residence, and to a lesser extent by class, although class is not as clearly divided as it once was. But certainly in the last two elections, 2016 and 2020, really reinforced and exacerbated those divisions. In shorthand, we call that polarization. The thing that was different this election, however, is that polarization only got worse and it accelerated in the wake of the election. Usually there's kind of a slowdown of partisanship and bitterness and polarization and conflict. There's a little bit of a so-called honeymoon for the incoming president. But the difference there was, of course, we got Donald Trump refused to concede the election, started at 2:30 a.m. on the morning of the election count, saying that the election had been stolen. It then became the insurrection or the crowd or the demonstrators, whatever your favorite term. Mitch McConnell said it was an insurrection, so I'm willing to go with what Mitch said it was. He started talking about it, and then he started doing something about it on January the 6th, when that crowd went up to Capitol Hill, broke in. There was mob violence. There were directly 5 deaths, one of them directly related right then on the spot, and 4 others shortly thereafter as a function of the violence and what happened in the sort of the taking over of the American Capitol. Capitol hadn't been ransacked since the British took it and burned it in 1812. That's how far back it goes. But the tradition of a peaceful transfer of power is a great American tradition. We had our first fundamental transfer of power from one party to the other, from the Federalist to Jeffersonian Republican Party in 1800, when Jefferson beat Adams. We have been doing peaceful transfer of power ever since, without any major disruption, even without major disruption in 1860 as the Civil War was beginning to break out. But the conflict was there, and it was there during the transition. The transition was an unusual one. It was fraught with a lot of conflict, and that conflict continues today because former President Trump continues to insist that he did not lose the election, that he had won the election, and he encourages his supporters to believe and to say the same thing. I have an AP, Associated Press study, that is really revealing on that issue to provide what I think is the best factual data you can get. AP did an enormous study of 25.5 million ballots that were cast in the 6 battleground states that were disputed by President Trump. A minuscule number of 475 cases came up out of 25.5 million ballots cast as maybe, not even for sure, but maybe a point where somebody cast what would have been an illegal ballot. But an extraordinary high percentage of people still believe that there was all kinds of fraud in those 6 states and across the country for that matter. Washington Post poll of January the 1st found that 68% of the American public say there was no solid evidence of widespread fraud, but 30% says that there was widespread fraud. 62% of Republicans said, January the 1st poll now, that there is such information pointing to widespread fraud. 58% of Republicans and 27% of independents say that Biden was not legitimately elected to be president of the United States. The only thing I would point out is it was 70% on January the 6th who believed that Biden was not legitimately elected. Okay, so there is that picture, group-based, identity-based, what we know about elections for sure, and what we know about American voting behavior. Now let me shift fairly quickly to part two, and that is how the census results from 2020 will impact the 2022 midterm elections, which of course are just around the corner, and the first election on what will be a 10-year cycle. I do want to give a shout out to Dr. Linda Flowers and Dr. Carl Flowers, the NAACP in general, and to the library. All of you were involved with trying to get Carbondale and Southern Illinois ready for the census. We started with that conversation a year and a half out in Carbondale, and Carbondale really took the lead in this area. And in that, both Drs. Flowers and the library played a major role, both in this town and in Southern Illinois, in my opinion, trying to get all of the people that were eligible to be counted, to get a fair count, as we called it. Now, we didn't get what we wanted out of that. We wanted a better count in terms of the numbers, but I have to say, I'm convinced that without all that good work that you folks did, it would have been a lot worse, both in Southern Illinois and in Carbondale. Okay, so the overall results. Let's start at the top there. In general, the nation's population has been moving toward the Sun Belt, the South and the Southwest for generations now, 3-4 censuses back. And that continued, even accelerated this time around. The American people are moving toward the coast and out of the old, what we now call the Rust Belt, which unfortunately is the Midwest, as well as New York and Pennsylvania and some of those East Coast cities or states. The new notable, first time ever in history, California actually lost population, and both Oregon and Montana gained population. As you undoubtedly know, Illinois continued our decline, which has been underway for 4 straight census rounds, maybe 5. Ever since I've been here, actually, we've been losing steadily population and votes in the House. And of course, that's what happens. Political power shifts with the numbers, and that's going to go that way again this time. New York has not been accustomed to losing. Now get this, and I think those of you who worked on the census can really appreciate the angst that this must have caused in New York. New York, as a state, lost their one member of Congress that they're losing by a shortage of only 89 people. If they had found 89 more people, they wouldn't have lost that congressional district. A little factoid here, the new population requirement will be about 761,000 people to have a congressional district. So, as I mentioned, you lose power politically, you lose numbers in the Electoral College vote, and most of the financial distribution at federal level and then at the state level comes, as many of you know, based on population, sometimes plus other variables, but population is the start of it. Texas picked up 2, the only state to get a +2. Those with +1 include Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Oregon, and Montana. The losers listed there: New York, California, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and West Virginia. So what does that mean politically? I'm going to spend some time on that. You can anticipate the answer to that. It gives a fairly serious disadvantage to the blue states and a serious advantage to the red states. And it particularly advantages those Sunbelt states, coastal states, most notably Florida and Texas. They're particularly advantaged here. In addition, the remap process is controlled entirely by the Republicans, in far more states than controlled, like in Illinois, for example, by the Democrats. I take the next part of what I'm going to give you from the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University. They do extraordinarily good work on this. I want to read a specific quote from their study entitled The Redistricting Landscape 21-22. The writer says, all told, Republicans will have solid control over drawing congressional maps in 18 states and drawing legislative maps in 20 states. The Democrats will have sole control of the congressional maps in only 7 states and legislative maps in only 9 states. The single party controlled states include Florida, Georgia, New Hampshire, and Texas, all of which were battleground states and all of which are terribly important states for who's going to win the presidency. The Democrats tried to win in those areas and simply came up short. So that means and translates into what's going to happen in the House. And you can make that translation pretty directly in some ways. There are 187 House seats that are controlled by the Republican states, legislature plus the governor. There are only 75 such seats controlled by the Democrats. We in Illinois, of course, are one of those 75. Just to fill out the rest of that, 167 seats are done by individual or independent commissions. That includes California, Colorado, and Virginia, all of which are blue states and purple states. So the long and short of that, for example, the change in New York was very likely going to hit the Democrats much harder. Now, that's all important because of the Shelby County versus Holder decision of 2013. That decision, as some of you know, is particularly centered on Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And we are back to talking about the 1965 Voting Rights Act because it couldn't be more relevant right now. That was the act that required the Department of Justice to give pre-clearance, as it's called, to any changes in voting and the electoral system that a state might be contemplating to see whether or not it has an impact on civil rights, and particularly civil rights for minorities, especially civil rights for Black people and Black voters. And that was the law from 1965 when Lyndon Johnson got it passed until 2013. No longer the law. The court, in a majority opinion written by the Chief Justice, said that partisanship and its influence on the drawing of maps is what's called a political question. It will not be justiciable, is the word they use. That is, it's not an avenue for charging that the maps are gerrymandered. The courts are not going to look into that, and the Supreme Court of the United States is not going to look into it, and they've proven that already in this election cycle. So now basically you can have a partisan gerrymander, and the federal courts are not going to intervene, quite unlike what was the case pre-Holder decision in 2013. Well, what's the impact of all of that? Everybody that's literate in American politics, and all of you here tonight undoubtedly are literate, you wouldn't be here joining us for something like this on a Tuesday evening. You already know the impact is that the party which wins the White House is almost always going to lose seats in the U.S. House and in the Senate in the next midterm election. Now, why is that? It doesn't seem self-evident. Why would it just be almost a law that the party that controls the White House then loses in the House and Senate? Actually, there's been a lot of political science research on this, and it's not all that clear, but whether we in political science can demonstrate just exactly what's going on there, what it gets translated into and what the media accept whole cloth is that it's a referendum on the president. That's relatively controversial in terms of empirical proof. It in some ways doesn't make any sense at all that it should be a referendum on the president. The president's only been in the White House for less than 2 years, but it's a probability statement, and it almost always happens. The Democrats thus carry a very heavy load going into the November elections. The expectations of almost everybody who's opinion leaders or pundits or commentators believe the Democrats are going to get clobbered in the midterm elections. Certainly the mass media talking about that all the time. Certainly the Republican Party talks about that a lot. And the Democrats themselves probably believe that they're likely to lose at least the House and maybe the Senate. It'll only take 6 votes in the House and 2 votes in the Senate to lose the House and the Senate. And let's look at that line that says the evidence. The average loss for the president's party in his first midterm election is 25 seats in the House, 1.2 seats in the Senate. Both of those are enough to flip it over if it were to go that way. It's going to be tough for the Democrats. Now, note that I said it's almost always, but not always, and I'll come back to that. But sometimes those losses have been really big, and they've been really devastating for the Democratic president that's in. In 1994, the losses in Bill Clinton's first midterm were absolutely astonishing. It was a tidal wave of rejection of Bill Clinton. I doubt it was a rejection of his policies because most people don't get very far into policies. But Clinton lost the House for the first time in 40 years, or I should say the Democrats lost the House for the first time in 40 years. And then President Obama in 2010, many of you will remember both of these very clearly. The president was beset by having pushed very hard for the Affordability Health Care Act, and he got it done. Got it done in that first term in 2010. But it was very unpopular at that point, and he was taking a lot of grief and a lot of trouble. And the Tea Party came on the scene, and the Democrats, as Barack Obama said, took a shellacking that night, was the way he put it. 2014, President Obama took it on the chin. The Democrats took it on the chin again, even though it was his second term, coming off of a fairly handy victory that he had over Mitt Romney. This, by the way, is why President Biden and his administration have been so fixed on getting a big legislative packet through the Congress. President Biden was criticized because the Build Back Better bill had all kinds of things, 6 major components of things Democrats had wanted and supported for generations. They pushed it all together into one major package. They put a lot of other stuff into that bipartisan, as it turned out, bill on infrastructure. And he had huge ambitions and huge plans because Joe Biden knows what he's doing in this case. He's a student of history. He was in the Senate for 36 years. He understands up close and personal what Newt Gingrich and the Republicans did to Bill Clinton when Newt Gingrich led the Republicans to a victory in 1994. And Newt Gingrich got credit or blame, whichever you want to look at it, for really starting or at least accelerating the polarization that's still with us today. Joe Biden was right at the arm's length and next door to President Obama all through those 8 years. And he saw how difficult it got for Obama and his policies starting in 2010 when the Democrats had no control over either the House or the Senate. So I think it's pretty clear why the president's done and why his administration have done all they could do to get their policies in place before the upcoming midterms. Dr. Flowers mentioned the Voting Rights Act. As you know, it's in big trouble. He's short 2 votes because of Manchin and Sinema, and it looks like its possibilities are really not very good. Parenthetically, if the Senate goes to the Republicans, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema will fade into the background, and they'll be obscure members of the minority party. Illinois Senator Dick Durbin, who's number 2 now in the majority, will become number 2 in the minority. So Dick Durbin stands to lose big in all of this. Now, I'm heading toward closure and questions and answers, but I do want to add to that. There are some arguments that can be made that this is not inevitable and that all the hanging of crepe by the Democrats not necessarily going to come about in November. It's a long time to November. A lot can change by then. Especially the COVID situation could get better. I think we're seeing signs that it may well, unless we get another one of these weird mutants. Inflation could abate, gasoline prices could come down if the Russians don't invade Ukraine. Those are the big ones. The president came into office needing COVID to go away, needing the economy to continue. Well, the economy is actually in very, very solid shape. You won't get that from listening to the media. Quick resume on that. Stock market is way up. 401 retirement plans way up. All of us that are in all kinds of retirement plans that invest in the stock market, that investment's way up. Unemployment rate is 3.8, which is very low. Parenthetically, in 2010 and 2014, President Obama got killed because all the media wanted to focus on was the unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate was down and coming down, or was up and going up. The unemployment rate, was down and going down. Employment was up and going up, both in 2010 and 2014, but it wasn't going up fast enough to suit a lot of people. So we're focused on inflation now. If we ever focused on some of those other things, it could be the narrative will change by November. That's the question. Can Joe Biden and the Democrats change that narrative? Because it's close to fixed into place. Joe Biden is probably working to do that and worrying about it, and all of his advisors are worrying about it, but certainly his job approval is not good now. It's been in the low 40s lately. He's got to have it a lot higher than that if it's going to be a referendum on the president. And again, the narrative simply got to change. There is some irony in all of this about the gerrymandering, and then this will be my last point. That is, this could work out a little better in places like Texas and Florida than the initial thought was, because so much of the growth came from the Hispanic population. And in some of those cases, it's going to be very difficult for the Republicans to gerrymander those Hispanic voters and those new voters in a way that will keep them from having options and the possibility of electing one more member of Congress under what's left of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So Democrats have their work cut out for them. The Republicans are already measuring the drapes. Kevin McCarthy thinks he's going to be Speaker of the House, and certainly Mitch McConnell thinks he's going to be back as the leader of the majority in the Senate. I would say, yes, if you were betting on it, that's probably the case. But again, at the outset, I noted this. It almost always happens that way, but it doesn't always. It's not what we call an iron law of politics. It's not inevitable. So let's keep an eye on it. I think it's going to be terribly interesting, very high conflict election, a lot of history being made here. The situation's never been one where the last election is still being refought. The interpretation of who won is still up for grabs for many millions of American people. All of that leads to conflict and instability and even threats of violence. So some of it's pretty sobering, but it's always interesting, at least to sort of groupies, political junkies like me, and hopefully many of you will find it equally interesting. Stay tuned for how it's all going to work, and I hope you'll be a little bit more up for following this and have some context that perhaps I've been able to provide for you this evening. So my plan was to complete by about a quarter till and have time for a conversation. I hope some of you have got some points you want to make or some questions you want to ask, and let's take time for question and answer now.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. At this time, we have no questions.
Wow.
Oh, wait, one just popped up. One moment,
One
please.
came in. Okay.
Yes,
I
sir.
thought maybe I put them all to sleep.
Okay. So the question, sir, is any idea how much effect will come from Trump supporters challenging in GOP primaries? Also, if they succeed, how well will those extreme candidates how well will those extreme candidates do in the election?
Let me make a note of the. Okay, two-part question. It's
yes, sir. It is.
First part. Question. Great question, and full of good stuff there on both points. A little paid commercial. I'm teaching a learning and retirement course, and it just happens I've been writing about that, getting the lectures together for that learning and retirement course that comes on March the 15th. Any of you retired people, I'd be happy to have you, but I have been thinking about that. That's huge because the divisiveness of those primaries is really hurtful for the party involved. In this case, it's almost all Republicans being involved. The challenge that Trump's made to Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, the challenge that he's made to Liz Cheney in Wyoming, for example, are excellent cases in point. The parties don't like those contested primaries, but the Trump people are going after some of these incumbents that they don't consider to be loyal enough to the president, former president, and they're going to make life pretty miserable. And what it's done in some cases is to drive off some really good recruits that Mitch McConnell went after in the Senate side, because McConnell tried to get 3 or 4 major Republican governors to run for the Senate seat. And he got that done in Georgia, where Senator Raphael Warnock is up again after 2 years. He got the guy that current senator beat, the Democrat, whose name is Perdue. He got Perdue to run against Warner, and that was really bad for the Republicans in the eyes of Mitch McConnell, because McConnell wanted what he thought was the stronger candidate, Perdue. So I cite that because Georgia was so absolutely pivotal, and because Trump has been able to have his way so far on the recruitment of candidates there and elsewhere. So that's playing out. He's got his own candidate running against Liz Cheney, for example. Now, that's part one. It's really bad for the party often in the general election to have one of those knockdown, drag out fights. because whoever wins has already been criticized, already been worked over, already got commercials out there after them, already had to spend a lot of money to prevail. So I could have actually, question implies, I could have listed that as one way in which things might work out a little better for the Democrats than what the ones who predict the Democrats are about to get clobbered might think at this point. Democrats have a few primary challenges, but not much, and they tend to be progressives. AOC, the congresswoman from New York, has been campaigning for a few progressives out in Texas, for example, but the Democrats don't have that kind of internal bloodletting going on. So I hope that's helpful for comeback or second part of the or response. I'd be glad to take that to speaker or any others that you've got coming in.
Yes, I have another one.
Takes people a little bit to think about what they want to say.
Yes, sir, I totally agree with you. One moment, please. Next question. How do we curtail our permissions after leaning on the reoccurring patterns of losing seats with midterm presidents?
How do we, I missed the first part.
Curtail.
Curtail that?
Yes,
Or
sir.
I think it was pessimism or pessimism.
Curtail pessimism?
Mhm.
Oh, okay. Well, I gave you some food for thought, hopefully, about why it's not an ironclad cinch that this is going to happen. It's not inevitable. And I listed 3 or 4 of those things. But the bigger question there, it seems to me, is how do you get the narrative turned around, and particularly the mass media? I'm all for free press, and I'm all for mass media doing and what they do, and I understand the First Amendment, but the media do get a kind of a mindset, and the current mindset is very negative for the Democrats. I don't care if you're talking about CNN or MSNBC on the one side or Fox News on the other. They all share those kinds of mindsets. And I think objective circumstance have to change. If we get out of the Russian mess without Russia invading, Joe Biden and his administration are going to get a lot of credit and be due a lot of credit. People are going to take a second look at Joe Biden as an old hand who was chair of Senate Foreign Relations Committee managing our foreign policy. That could be a turnaround point right there, it seems to me. The economy could get better if gasoline prices, that's not the only indicator of the economy, but if gasoline goes down, that narrative is going to change. So the objective, what's happening in reality, may change enough that enough people, but we're talking about enough people, meaning tens of millions of people have to pay attention. That's why you have to be informed about this stuff. That's why good meetings like this and community conversations like this are useful.
Yes, sir. Your next question, sir, is do you think it will be an issue when Dick Durbin retires?
Yes, there's a seat that rarely comes open. Dick's been in since 1996 when he took Paul Simon's place. He's now one of the most senior, and I would guess may not run again, but there will be lots of ambitious Democrats who want that seat and been waiting in the wings. I don't know who I would say is, I don't think there is an heir apparent right now, but yes, it'll be huge. Of course, Senator Duckworth is up this time, and you haven't heard much about that race. That's because Republicans haven't been able to recruit anybody, as far as I know, or certainly nobody of any note, to take on Tammy Duckworth, which is really unusual in a sense, because this is her first re-up. She's only been in one term. So that one's coming before Dick Durbin seats up.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Your next question. Do you think Dick Durbin's seat will go Republican since the state is turning more red in recent pollings in Southern Illinois?
No. Short answer to that. As goes Southern Illinois, so goes not much of the rest of the state. We've turned totally red except for Jackson County and occasionally Alexander County in Southern Illinois, which is a huge change from when I came here. But suburban Chicago has turned from the stronghold backbone of the Republican Party to being up for grabs. It used to be that DuPage County was the backbone of the Republican Party in this state. DuPage County votes for Democrats now, and all the other collar counties except for McHenry. There's no way a Republican going to win the statewide Senate race if that condition still holds, and it probably will when Durbin steps aside. Southern Illinois, reddest district you can find. Either Mary Miller or Mike Bost is going to be the next congressman from this district. There are 3 totally red districts that have been drawn. There are 2 more toss-ups, and then the rest should be Democratic in my expectation.
Thank you. Next question. What can local Democrats do now to increase voting for Democrats in 2022?
Well, start getting organized, start planning, the traditional party strength, any party organization strength has got to be that work at the grassroots. That's why I was talking about turnout first. You can't get people to turn out if you don't get them registered. You got to get them registered. You got to get them to polls. I know a lot of you folks have worked on that in the past. It's fundamental, and the parties are weaker and weaker about doing that. When I came here, Democratic Party across Southern Illinois was powerhouse. Not much left of that. Only Jackson County really is the party organization as such still strong. So other groups have to step in. You got to work on voter registration. And we're a transient community. You got to do it all again in the fall, but you got to get them registered, and then you got to get them out to vote. You got to have people going door to door, because that's the best form of persuading people, go get registered, go vote. That's why registration and voting and all that stuff about the Voting Rights Act is so important. But it won't hit Illinois the way it's hit some of these other states, because Illinois has made it easier to vote, not harder to vote, and easier to get registered, not harder.
Thank you. Next question. How well do state legislator elections predict general elections?
That's a hard one to answer. The state legislative races are important indicators of the party at the grassroots. And, if you get a district that's got all Republican legislators at the state level, which we have now in Southern Illinois, then you got a congressional district that looks like the Mike Bost, Mary Miller district. It's as red as can be. So there is a causal effect. There is a direct line from all of those county courthouse people and all those state legislators being Republican across all kinds of counties. Franklin County, Randolph County used to be strongholds for the Democrats. Now they're strongholds for the Republicans. So there is a correlation, certainly.
Thank you. Next question. Where is the light at the end of the tunnel for Democrats?
Well, to some extent, you can't downgrade having won the presidency, because that's the most important prize of all. Joe Biden, if things look about the way they look now, will be a formidable candidate in 2024. And in that sense, the president is by far the most important representative of the party. But it's going to be a tough passage between new Congress coming in 23 and then getting through the fall 24 elections. And it depends a lot on how those midterms go in November.
Thank you. Next question. My memory of the Obama election is that there was a lot of grassroots organization in addition to heavy fundraising. Democratic elections now seem to be fundraising only. In your experience and expert view, do you see that as a factor of the present election, or it just a factor of midterm elections without a national emphasis?
Well, I think there's a lot to the idea that money dominates so much. And the question is, the big people with big bankrolls like Ken Griffin in this state are going to give those mega millions. And most of ordinary folks like us can't write those kind of checks. And so you've got to get into raising money at the $25 to $250 range. The Republicans have done that better than the Democrats, and Democrats need to step up their game on that. The party at the courthouse level, however, is dependent on getting people to go out and knock on those doors and getting people to hold voting registration kinds of events. And that's where organizations like the NAACP, for example, and other civic organizations can get involved and generally make a big difference when they do.
Thank you, sir. Next question. What are the odds of a minority winning a political seat for Southern Illinois?
It depends on the seat, and it depends on what part of Southern Illinois. I would say it lied just a little bit up to the Metro East. There are two African-American legislators in the Metro East that are Democrats right now. That's typically a stronghold, particularly St. Clair. That's fudging a bit on Southern Illinois. I can't think of a seat in Southern Illinois that a minority is likely to win. I might be missing something, but I can't get, I mean, at the state legislative level, certainly at the county level, there are seats already held in county board seats and city council seats and so forth.
All right, thank you. Next question. Is there anything President Obama could do to foster Democratic turnout and motivate it?
Well, he has been going to some critical states, and he has done, he went and tried to help the governor, Democratic candidate in Virginia, and Virginia got lost and the Republicans took over. So he wasn't magic there, but he is magic when he turns out to go to lots of different places. Anytime he shows up, he can do some good. There's no question about that. And he uses his time carefully, but he's been out and about, and I expect it'll pick up when it gets to be October, for example. He and Joe Biden still have a hugely positive relationship. And he knows what he went through in 10 and 14. And he doesn't want to wish that off on Joe Biden because they are remarkably close and remarkably on the same page.
Yes, sir. Thank you again for that. And that looks like that is the end of the questions.
There's one in the chat.
Okay, well, it's been a pleasure being with you, folks.
All right, so at this time, we would like to thank everyone for tuning in tonight. Please like us at Carbondale NAACP so that you can receive updates on the next scheduled community conversation. Thank you again for tuning in and have a good night.